Glad to welcome you today. My name is Shakti Sinha. Our speaker today is Dr. Harsh Pant. He'll be speaking on global power shifts in India. But before I really introduce Harsh and go ahead, just a word to everybody. I send out a lot of messages personally, but that is based on my phone scrolling through my WhatsApp. So sometimes you'll get it from me, sometimes you will not get it from me. Human frailties. We are not yet fully organized. In our posters that I've sent across, I've given our email ID, info@AIPRIS, info.AIPRIS@msubaroda.ac.in. It's on the poster, even if I'm making a mistake. Please just drop us an email and we can put you on a mailing list to make sure that you are aware of the program. Hopefully you'll join us as much as possible, but that'd be very nice so that we know who our people are. Number two is that, these Friday webinars we do, since our name of the institution is Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies. So every alternate week, we alternate between foreign policy and public policy, basically. And that's the series that's going on. Like today, Dr. Pant will be speaking on foreign policy. Next week, we'll have a seminar on public policy where Dr. Ila Pant, very eminent economist, will be speaking on Atmanirbhar Bharat, and so on and so forth. We'll continue the series. Now, coming to today's session, Dr. Pant is Director of Studies and Head of Strategic Studies Program of the Observer Research Foundation, of India's premier think tanks. He also holds a joint appointment at the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College London. I'm glad to say he's staying with us. So that part gets secondary, and we see him very active in India. Harsh is also a non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the CSIS, Washington, D.C. Professor Pant has been a visiting professor at IIM Bangalore, a visiting fellow at Kasi, University of Pennsylvania, a visiting fellow at McGill, and emerging leaders fellow at Melbourne. His current research focuses on Asian security studies. His recent books include New Directions in India's Foreign Policy, Theory and Praxis, published by Cambridge University Press, India's Nuclear Policy, Oxford University Press, The US Pivot and Indian Foreign Policy, Bolger Macmillan, Handbook of Indian Defense Studies, Routledge, and going further back to his book on India's Afghan model and the US-India nuclear policy. He writes very, very regularly for Indian and international media outlets. So you see him in Japan Times, in the Wall Street Journal, Hindustan Times, Telegraph, and other Indian media. We are facing a very critical time in world affairs because the change that we thought would come about one day, the change in the global power status from bipolar world during much of the late 20th century to the unipolar world, which lasted roughly till almost less than 20 years, 2008 or so, and then the rising challenge that the USA is facing after that from China and secondarily from Russia and their combination. People talk about these shifts in international politics. Thucydides' trap is often cited, but when this shift actually comes, we're often caught unprepared for it. Are we better prepared this time? Is India in a position to move it? And how does India see itself? And with the changing circumstances, where will India find itself? I'll not speak more on the subject. Let me hand you over to Dr. Harsh Pant. Before that, may I request everybody to kindly mute themselves, because sometimes involuntarily some sounds come in, which does disturb the speaker. And we're looking forward to hearing Dr. Pant, so we should give him a full chance. After Harsh has spoken for about half an hour or so, and then we can then open it up for questions and answers. With that, Harsh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shakti, and thank you, MS University Baroda, for having me. This is it's always a pleasure to be either sharing a panel or speaking with Shakti. So when he invites you for this session, it's always wonderful to be able to engage not only with I think senior academics, but also a lot of youngster students. Because primarily the question of global power shift in particular is related to the future and is related to India's role in a world that is rapidly evolving in a direction that I think few of us have any clarity about. So the questions and the issues that emerge out of this, this tussle will have great bearing, and we know it is having a great bearing on all our lives around us. Just in the last 1.5 years, we have seen world change, we have seen lives around us change, and that change is being manifested in different ways around us, sometimes very personally, sometimes institutionally, sometimes politically, and sometimes structurally. So I think the topic itself, great power shifts, and India's engagement with that shift is a very topical one, and is something that I think for a dynamic foreign policy, one has to be constantly cognizant of this one reality, because rise and fall of major powers, powers rising and falling, is the one standard principle in international relations. If there is one fundamental law in IR, international relations, it is that powers rise and powers fall over a period of time, of course, and over a generation. But as I think Shakti was saying, that we are often states find themselves unprepared for that eventuality. Often we find ourselves that we are in a state where we don't really understand why this is happening and whether we should have been better prepared. This is a question that is often asked today in the context of China, not only in India, but across the world. If you look at what is the fundamental debate about China, it is that, have we misunderstood? Why did we go so wrong in assessing China's rise, that we saw a sudden burst of China? And here is it, from west to the east, everyone is scurrying around trying to figure out what to do with China, as if this was not really, it could not really have been predicted. In fact, people were talking about it. Books were being written about it. What will happen when China becomes really the big player in the game? But somehow the assessment was that it would take some time, and the time management factor is a very crucial one. So as I was pointing out, the essential component of any international relations understanding is that the power structures, which basically constitute the international systemic architecture, it continues to evolve in one direction or the other. And of course, in our lifetimes, some of our lifetimes, we have seen the movement from the multipolar engagement of the Second World War to a bipolar evolution of the international system. And that bipolarity continued throughout the Cold War, and it ended with the so-called unipolar moment when Soviet Union just disappeared off the face of this earth. And the idea that suddenly the world had become unipolar in that sense, of course, there was this argument that it was a fleeting moment. It was a moment that would not last. But I think that was a crucial element, because it generated a whole host of debates in the world. So on the one hand, you had Francis Fukuyama, who was saying end of history. In early 1990s, if you go to the big ideas, when Cold War had ended, you had two divergent opinions. That was a time of great liberal victory. That was a moment of great coming of age of the international system. The idea that somehow now free market capitalism and liberal democracy would spread around the world. Every country would embrace it, and eventually all the nations would look alike, and therefore conflict would be reduced. From there, if you see the debate evolving, moving, going forward, we have seen that shift from that unipolar moment today, then to a discussion about what sort of international architecture, power shift are we looking at today. And again, the debate is out there. I don't think there is a single argument to be made at this point, but suddenly you have two ways of assessing it. One of it is that you are moving to a position where we are once again entering into a bipolar international structure, with the China's rise very dramatic, very distinguished, very in its own way symptomatic of what China brings to the table. In that sense, the larger dynamic of global power shifting into a mode where you are finally seeing one big challenger to the US in comprehensive power terms. Still not an absolute power terms. You are seeing, sometimes people talk of American decline as if American decline is a reality that we are witnessing in front of our own eyes. No, it is a relative decline. If you look at the components of power, America still reigns supreme in terms of components if you aggregate the power structures. But the rise of China and also the rise of so-called others is making it very clear that America has relatively declined from the point of the great unipolar moment in the early 1990s. And as a student of international relations, I can go back to that phase and often talk about some of those aspects. And I would encourage the students here to do that, because that was an interesting moment in international relations. Some of those debates are still relevant. I mentioned Francis Fukuyama's argument about free market capitalism, liberal democracy, but who came back and repulsed that argument and rebuffed that argument? That was Samuel Huntington, and his argument was that economic globalization, something on which Francis Fukuyama was building his argument. Huntington's argument was that the same argument that you are making to and he was arguing with Fukuyama, that this idea that economic globalization is going to lead to this one world or one kind of world, is basically a load of nonsense, because what is going to happen is that countries are going to go back, or nations are going to go back to their civilizational roots. And so his argument about clash of civilizations, his argument about how civilizations will become the determining factor in international relations, how identity politics would become so important. And I think a lot of those debates are still with us. And in fact, the way we are moving in certain directions is reminiscent of what is happening. But the other debate was how America will be able to sustain that unipolar moment, whether other powers will rise and they will eventually challenge the US. And that is something that we are witnessing today as well, that you have the rise of China. That is the most important strategic development in international relations over the last several decades in our generation, and the impact it is having on various, and this power dynamic that is having on other countries around the world. And that is a very significant argument that one has to make in terms of individual nations' foreign policies as well. So, if you just go to what has happened since COVID-19 struck us, say a year and a half back, most of the trends that we are talking about today were visible before COVID-19. And the rise of China, institutional decay, fragmentation of global economics, all of those were very visible. I think COVID-19 has accelerated those trends. The idea that China is today dominating international institutions is something that was coming and that was visible. But what COVID-19 has done, the experience of COVID-19 has done, is to give us a sense of what happens when there is a transition of power, how nations, how states manipulate and use international institutions to their advantage, because they think that now they have the capacity to shape those institutions. So on the one hand, you have the structural dynamic of China rising, the impact of China rising on institutional issues, global institutional issues, on normative issues. China is challenging the maritime order, maritime norms, for example, in a large part of the world. China is challenging us on the border, the kind of normative and agreements that we had come to terms with China. So I think the challenge here is to think of this power shift, not simply in terms that rise of China would do this to us, but also in terms of the global structural dynamic, that when a new power comes into being, that new power will try to map out the institutional arrangements, the normative arrangements that has existed and with which we have lived for the last several decades. That challenge is coming. And I think a lot of the concern, a lot of the anxiety in the world is about that. Not about China rising per se. Of course, that is having an impact on individual countries, but also that the larger structure of international institutions, larger structure of normative ideas that have been created, that is being challenged every single day. So how do we relate to that? How do we come to terms with that? How do we figure out a foreign policy and national security response to that? That's the big agenda for every country, irrespective of where we are. You can go to Africa, you can go to Latin America, you can go to Indo-Pacific, and of course, you can look at it from Delhi's perspective. The single most important issue for all nations today is how do you figure out this arrangement between the US and China, this contestation that is happening between US and China, and where do you stand? How do you shape your foreign policy, your national security strategy at a time when a lot of the assumptions with which you have crafted those foreign policy narratives are coming under pressure? And that challenge in some ways is the big idea of our times, that we are struggling with that. We are all struggling with that. It is not simply an Indian story. It is also a story of America. It is also a story of Europe. It is also a story in Australia and Japan, because that's the sudden upsurge of China and the way it has shaken up the international structure and the inability of existing institutional architecture to mediate those conflicts. That, in a sense, is the big story of our times. And India, we have seen India's attempts to come to terms with that. We have seen how India has struggled to just manage China over the last several decades. But what has happened last year has, in a sense, shaped and reshaped India's vision of how it wants to deal with China and how it wants to engage the rest of the world. And here, rather than going into a lot of specifics about border and India's national security dynamic, which I'm sure some of you will raise during the question and answer, I want to talk more in the cognitive sense of the term. That what is, this, if you're looking at the China challenge today, because that's the larger global shift that is happening, you can figure out other shifts within that larger shift. There is a shift happening with regard to India's relationship with the West. There is a shift happening with regard to India's relationship with Russia. There is a shift happening with regard to India's relationship with its own neighborhood. All those shifts are part of this larger reality that China has imposed not only on India, but on a large part of the world. But what I want to do is not to talk about individually empirical cases, which we can come to it later. But what is the cognitive challenge here in large terms? Now, one is that the one thing that we have to acknowledge and recognize is that this China challenge is not a passing one, that it is not something that we are going to solve today, tomorrow, or even in a year's time. This is a generational change. This is a generational shift. And this coping with this asymmetry is India's long-term challenge. So China is a long-term challenge, and coping with this asymmetry between India and China is going to be the most fundamental foreign policy and national security issue for India. And I'll come to it. Why is it not simply a national security and foreign policy issue? Why is it also a domestic policy issue? So next time when Shakti talks about public policy, there are issues of public policy involved here, because you can't really, this is a whole of government approach. This is a national dynamic in terms of how we think about India, how we think about India's public policy challenges, and how we think about managing those challenges, because the time for shunning away from choices is gone. We really, we do not really have the time which we used to have, and we still do at times, tying ourselves in knots about theory, about whether strategic autonomy comes first, whether non-alignment comes first. What do you mean by alignment? What do you mean by non-alignment? I think that time has gone. So the critical question now is what kind of choices we make. And so, I just want to make 3 points. One, in the context of the global power shift, in the context of China's rise, and in the context of India's choices, that India has never faced a big power near its border before. We have had great power challenges, but you had America, you had Soviet Union, but China as a major power challenge that is challenging not only India, but also the structure of the international system that is unique to India at this point, that is unique in some ways to India's national security foreign policy dynamic. And therefore, 3 questions arise. One challenge is a cognitive challenge. I think we have been far too blasé to recognize the challenge that China poses. This question of, for a long time, the sense that yes, China is rising, but that rise is manageable. For a long time, this sense that somehow we have done, or we have come to terms with the rise of China because we have managed China through certain agreements. That understanding itself creates a cognitive dissonance. That idea itself today is being challenged by China in so many fundamental ways that I think for us not to have thought about this possibility is perhaps the biggest issue for us at the moment. And therefore, to recognize the challenge in terms of that here is a major power rising in our vicinity, and this is going to have a significant consequence for the kinds of choices that India will make. Again, not this year, not next year, but over a generation. So I think we have been, a bit too blasé about those choices. That ho jayega syndrome, that we will manage, we will somehow, we are doing a good job in terms of keeping China tied up to a certain agreement along the border, and we will manage it when the time comes. And we have seen that that does not happen, that we were not prepared for the kind of challenge that China has suddenly posed to us. And we were unprepared to even think of that eventuality, that this will happen. And so if once that happens, what will be our options? So I think this is one of the most important cognitive challenges in some ways. How do we think about this rise, and how we think about the choices that we have to make? I think a lot is happening today in the public policy discourse, in foreign policy discourse on some of the choices. But I think we are already late in the game. So clearly we will have to ramp up and we'll have to move forward in terms of finalizing those choices. The other is this notion or this aversion to building coalitions. You still get the sense in a lot of the conversations, oh, this is ultimately our fight, we will have to fight it on our own. Of course, China is our what happens in the border, we'll have to fight it out on our own. But the issue is, why does India have to be so averse to building coalitions, building alliances? This is statecraft 101. You read any theoretician of IR, or you read any of your ancient masters from Kautilya to Sun Tzu. The first thing they tell you is the role of alliances, the role of relationships, the role of coalitions in managing threats. But in India, we have fetishized this idea of non-alignment, which means basically that we don't want to be tied up with anyone. This idea that somehow alliances are generically bad. Somehow that if you enter into an alliance, of course it extracts costs, but not entering into alliance or not entering into a coalition also extracts the costs. So I think that the question is, how do you figure out a response? How do you figure out an arrangement with like-minded nations that brings the convergence to the fore, and that allows you to develop your own capacities by leveraging their advantages? Now, this is something that China has done brilliantly. China was first with the Soviet Union, it used Soviet capacities, then it moved to America, it used American capacities, and finally it is challenging America. But in India, we are still ideological about alliances. We think that if you enter into a relation, in engagement with the US, it means that we are looking at something very fundamentally shifting in India's strategic ability to challenge our threat perceptions. So and of course there is a dilemma there. There are questions from historical memory, etc., etc. But I think the essential question always remains that, can we leverage our relationships to our advantage? Can we leverage our partnerships to our advantage? If we can do that, it adds heft to our ability to shape our foreign policy environment. So you cannot really say that non-alignment or strategic autonomy is an end in itself. Protecting our national interest is an end. Everything else is a means. Whether it is alignment, whether it is non-alignment, whether it is strategic autonomy, these are all means to a certain end. Sometimes we confuse means and ends, and we end up in a dynamic where we just start mixing and matching these concepts. So I think the idea that we have to be pragmatic about it, the idea that we have to leverage alliances, that the idea that coalitions in this day and age is not something which should be shunned, is entering into the Indian public policy discourse or foreign policy discourse. But it's still not there yet. We are still not there yet. We still take too much time in thinking about eventualities of these alignments, and we can come to some of the specifics later on. Finally, the point that I want to make is that ultimately, a lot of these questions on China are questions about India. That the China problem is ultimately an India problem. Why have we not been able to develop the kind of capabilities, the kind of capacities that we should have had for a long time? China did not stop us from developing infrastructure on our sides of the border. China does not stop us from bringing in internal reforms, whether they are defense reforms, whether they are economic reforms, whether they are agriculture reforms, whether they are all kinds of reforms that are needed to manage the build-up of capacities in this country. So, and we know those challenges are huge. India is a very complicated democracy. But at the end of the day, this is a question about India's own internal dynamic. That unless we get our own act together in terms of public policy, in terms of building the kind of capacities we need to tackle the China challenge, or to tackle even the challenge that the world is changing, the global order is changing, and the topic of the day, that balance of power is shifting, and global balance is shifting. If that is shifting, then at the end of the day, India is only as good as its internal capacities make us to be. So at the end of the day, it is for us to decide how far we want to go and what kind of a role to play. We will not be able to play a very ambitious role. Our foreign policy can articulate a very ambitious role, but unless our domestic capacities are in sync with those ambitions, we won't be able to play that role. So ultimately, it's also a question of getting those issues right, from education to environment to economic capacities to defense capacities. All of these issues have been there for a long time. We knew for a long time that certain kinds of defense reforms are needed. We knew for a long time that certain kinds of infrastructure had to be built, but somehow we lost, the trajectory did not move in the right direction. And so the question becomes that, in a sense, if this is a generational change, we will have to start from home by making India the focal point of our capacity generation, because only then will we be able to attract coalition partners. Today, if there are coalition partners that today countries around the world want to partner with India, they want to partner with India because India has been managed to project certain kinds of capacities into the international system based on, we are celebrating 30 years of economic reforms, a very important, very important inflection point in India's history, where India actually managed to deliver those reforms and delivered, and those reforms allowed certain kinds of capacities to be built. So if India can be ambitious today about being a $5 trillion economy over the next few years, that is a tribute to the way our economic reforms have been managed and the capacities that they've generated. But we are certainly, again, behind the curve in so many areas. This is we are doing this in an educational setup, and I think education is one area. We often crib about it, Indian education system, and Chinese have done this. Chinese steal. They do all kinds of manipulation. But I think one area where they really have invested is education. And there is a very interesting argument which I often make. There are these global rankings that comes out in the West. Now, in India, they become ideological. That, India is a very complicated country, so Indian education institutions cannot be compared to Western education institutions. So there should be no comparison. What we will do is we will in fact have our own list. Our own rankings. Now, no one in the world buys those rankings. Indian middle classes themselves don't buy those rankings, but we are developing those rankings, and the rest of the world has moved on. China has moved on. China never cribbed about those rankings. 2 decades back, none of the Chinese institutions were in top 20. Today, there are 7. So I think that the idea there is that they have developed that leverage, those capacities by being a bit more honest about their challenges. Not denying the fact that they are manipulative and they have done all kinds of things to all kinds of countries and they are challenging everything. But the issue here is, unless the capacities within India develop to a point where we are able to become an attractive partner to the rest of the world, and that attraction allows us to generate even more capacities for ourselves, we are in a very difficult position to manage this global power transition. Because this power transition, this global power shift, requires not only a foreign policy perspective, but at the end of the day, a whole of government perspective and a national perspective, which at the end of the day should be what we should be aiming for if we are looking for India's ability to shape the coming decades and coming century with greater degree of finesse, with greater degree of articulation, and with greater degree of confidence that India is going to be a very important player in the way international system evolves. I will end there, Shakti, and I will be happy to discuss specifics. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions, but let me exercise my right as chair to just say a few things. was speaking, giving his points, especially three major points, I was getting a sense of deja vu. You say, why? Global shift didn't happen in my memory, right? No, but if I look to the 50s, and I especially refer to a book of Mr. A.S. Bhasin, Avatar Bhasin, just come out on Nehru, Tibet in China, you can get some of the same things. Now, a power was rising. Nehru sensed it. Nehru was listening to sense it. He welcomed China, but at the same time, he was a little wary of China because now he could say India and China became neighbors. Tibet's autonomy was being eroded and whittled away and then brutally removed. And suddenly the problem had come to our neighborhood. His belief was that geography, high Himalayas, non-alignment, how will China attack India? And there is no person in the world to protect India. So instead of investing in capacities, we hoped that things would get sorted out themselves. A point that you made, that what are the choices we are making? We are behind the curve because we think things will sort themselves out. Other was very specifically that either you counter a strong country on your borders through military means, which means strengthen your military. For that, you require resources. You have the right economic policies. Again, a point Harsh made, that public policy in this, you have to see it in a whole of government approach. We chose the wrong economic policies, which left us with no money for defense. And because we averse to allies, even though America was very keen right in the beginning, especially after Tibet was taken over, on how to make Chinese life uncomfortable in Tibet, India refused to go along largely. India felt, no, we can't get involved in these things. So you're foreclosing your options, and yet you want things to change. When Chanakya was very clear, among the 7 pillars of the state, full state, Mitra, a foreign alliance, was a very important part of it. But we deride Nehru, but stick on to Nehru's ideas that we should not have alliances. So that is the kind of situation that you feel, that we really are missing out on things and hoping that things will improve by themselves. Free riding on Afghanistan ultimately did not help because you ultimately need real power. And there's an asymmetry between ability to project power and your aspirations to do so. It does cause a lot of anguish. Like you are today upset, how did we lose Afghanistan? Well, it was never yours to begin with. You could not have lost something that you didn't have, right? But we land up unfortunately asking the wrong questions. So I'm glad Harsh has raised this point very strongly. I can see a couple of points, and Harsh would like to respond to. Ravi Day, does China, Gautam Sen, I'll come to you, I've questions already. Others, please raise your hands in the option box, I can see you. So does China consider India as a like-minded nation? Where does the gap exist between our nations, the gap analysis? The first part, obviously, it's not, but I'll let Harsh do that. And Karan Sopuri has asked, what role do you foresee China playing in Afghanistan, and specifically to Taliban and Uyghur culture and sympathy, etc.? China is clamping down on the Uyghurs and developing friendship with the Taliban. How does this contradiction pan out? Then the other great questions, we'll come to Mr. Vikram soon, we'll come to Gautam Sen. But if you just could take up these 2 questions, Harsh, it'd be great. Yeah, Harsh, you're muted. Harsh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Shakti. I think I don't think China and India are in any way like-minded nations. I think China's approach to global politics, to the way it looks at its own role in the world is very clear now. I think there used to be a debate at one point in time where this was about China being a different kind of a global power. I personally don't think there are different kinds of global power. There is only one kind of global power, but I think there was a debate that will China be a different kind of a global power, and will it not do things that other global powers have done in the past? Power is inherently expansionist in nature. So the more you acquire it, the greater desire you have to acquire more, and that's what, in some ways, China is demonstrating. It is also demonstrating that this idea of its historical memory, the way it sees its role in the past, how it wants to get back to that role, that is driving a lot of Xi Jinping's agenda of national rejuvenation of China. So clearly, I think in that, India is a nuisance. India is a problem. India challenges China on many fronts. If India can be tamed, a lot of China's ability to be the single most important player in the wider Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific gets so much more enhanced. Because India is, in some ways, clearly redefining the contours of just the size, the scale of India makes it very difficult for China to ignore India. So I don't think there is a like-minded. The two nations are like-minded. The gap certainly exists at multiple levels. I think my own sense is that this. Of course, you can do a quantitative analysis. You can look at GDP per capita. You can look at defense expenditure. But those numbers don't really reveal something. Also don't tell you the entire story. We don't know China's real expenditure on defense. We don't know China's what is happening in Chinese economy. There are so many ifs and buts about China. But I think the larger issue here is that in some ways, the gap that I see is a gap in terms of operationalizing this idea of China as a major power and working on it, operationalizing it. How, and there India has always staked its claim to be a great power for it. We have been saying India is a major power since, and we believe so, since we became independent. I mean, India was never diffident about saying that. The only problem was that the capacity was an issue. The capacity problem did exist, and that capacity could not be leveraged to our advantage. Now, the gap that really exists is a cognitive one in some ways, that we are still not prepared to be as perhaps brutal in the pursuit of power as the Chinese have become. Perhaps we should not. But the question is, then our ambitions will have to be made in sync with our capacities. So if, there used to be a debate at one point in India, and there still is, many people have argued that India should not be in the business of becoming a major power or a great power, and India should concentrate. India has so many domestic challenges. India should be concentrating on building, on working for its socio-economic development, etc., etc. In my own senses, that's a false argument, because eventually you don't really become a major power because you shout from the rooftop. You become a major power in the international system because you have the capacities that influence, that can influence the outcome of global, on global questions. So India has been rising, in terms of its capacities, and therefore India's voice on every front is now needed. It's very palpable. You can't really tackle environmental change. You can't really think of global governance issues without India being a party to it. Similarly, China came to that much earlier, and China became a much more important actor there. But the gap, therefore, exists in terms of how do we articulate our own, role and our own ability to engage with our adversaries and with our friends. I think Chinese have made certain decisions about it. We are still struggling to make those decisions about it. We still, we are very reluctant to call spade a spade. In some ways, we are still reluctant to manage some of those issues where, the challenges out there. I mean, if you go back, and it seems from a different era almost, when we had a Pokhran 2 nuclear tests, and George Fernandez said China is the enemy number one. The kind of debate that ensued in this country, it's almost, that itself tells you a certain story that for a long time it was, that lack of clarity in our thinking about where do you prioritize, how do you prioritize, because clearly you have a number of challenges, and how do you go about it. So I think the gap certainly exists in terms of our operationalizing these ideas into more, into foreign policy and national security dynamics. Some of those issues, I think, continue to be with us even today, when we have had a big challenge on the border. I think some of the questions are being resolved on their own. India has been forced to recognize that this is certainly not going to, the business as usual is not going to work. India will have to make certain choices. We just have to look at this idea of Quad. It emerged in 2007, and India and Australia were the two countries that did not really like the idea, because for them this was too aggressive or too, China would take it the other way. And so we were concerned about Chinese reactions. But by 2017, India did not get any benefit of actually going back on Quad. And by 2017, Quad had to be resurrected. So I think a lot of these issues which are coming back to haunt us are also a reflection of a certain diffidence that we showed early on. So I think there the gap is actually very palpable, and I mentioned the ability to make certain kinds of decisions within the larger political economy of the country, which I think also allows China to do certain things that the Indian political economy does not allow India to do. But on the Afghanistan question, I think it's an interesting one, because I'm not. There is a lot of expectation that China would. After America, China is the most important actor in the region. And given Chinese equities in Pakistan, they would perhaps be willing to play a more significant role in Afghanistan. I very much doubt that. I don't think that they are really willing to invest too much in Afghanistan. They will only invest as much as they think they can get a return on, and that too via Pakistan. A lot of things are happening at the moment. In Pakistan, China is facing some challenges in CPEC. They are facing some challenge on the Taliban question itself, because it's not readily evident that we will have that shift from, they will be able to protect the Xinjiang question from the rise of extremism if Taliban come to power. So I think a lot of those issues are interrelated. But I think if we are expecting China to do heavy lifting, I don't think they are going to do any great heavy lifting. I think they have also gotten used to the American umbrella, and much like India, I think, and now that Americans are gone, the question for them would be how do they also cut their losses? But they have one asset that India does not have, which is Pakistan, and I think most of their foreign policy approach towards Afghanistan would be funneled through Pakistan at the moment. So they are of course engaging Taliban. They're of course making it seem as if Taliban gives them this assurance of on Xinjiang, and they would be able to invest in Afghanistan. I don't think they have always, for the last 2 decades, in fact, they have overcommitted and under-delivered in Afghanistan. None of the projects that they said they are going to invest have actually come to fruition in Afghanistan as far as China is concerned. So I think they are, in that sense, they are very cautious about the returns that they expect from their investments. And my own sense is that is going to continue for them, even without Americans being there, or even with the Taliban.
Harsh, I have 6 questions on hands, so I request you to be fast, a little briefer with your responses. They are very good, of course. Vikram Sood asks a very fundamental question. Do you think the US ability to shape events will reduce sharply by the end of the decade? Will China be the partial successor to the USA? That's Mr. Vikram Sood's question. And then I'll go on to the many hands raised. If you could tackle that one. Mute.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, sir. And I hope Mr. Sood, I'm sure Mr. Sood knows this much better than I do. But I'll my own sense is that I think certainly American ability is reducing, and it will continue to reduce. But I don't see China as succeeding to an extent that perhaps they think they would, and many think they would. Because what I think and this is something that that comes out very categorically in the last year itself. We used to talk about Chinese with a certain degree of awe. China is this great strategic thinker, this great strategy that China is following. Even in the US, we had this big articles being written about Chinese soft power and how China is shaping the region without actually doing much. In India, we used to often have this comparison that China has gotten a lot of things very well, which they have, in fact. And my own sense is that they've got a lot of things well in the domestic space, where I think clearly the way their political system is structured allows them that flexibility. India takes much longer in making those decisions. But I think what the last year and a half has also exposed are Chinese vulnerabilities. That the world, that at the moment they are facing a pushback from the world. I think if you look, if you were a strategic thinker in China, you would not be very happy with the fact that most of the countries surrounding you do not look favorably upon you. So I think China's success would also depend in some ways how far this pushback is successful. At the moment, there is a nascent pushback that is emerging, but that pushback would require consistent efforts and consistent investment by all the stakeholders. And there are lots of ifs and buts, because I think what is happening in the US context is the domestic context is changing. And this ability of US to actually continue to project power abroad is getting limited with every single day. So that domestic political context constrains America's ability to do some things which in another world they would have done. But now, given the domestic change that is happening, given the inward orientation that American politics is going through, I think it will be very difficult for the US to sustain that. Even Biden is facing a lot of difficulty in projecting or in making this case of great multilateralism that he came to office with. So I think that challenge will allow, will put a lot of onus on middle ranking powers like India. And I think that is where India's role emerges. And India will, hopefully India will shoulder that burden.
Follow up?
I'll take two questions now. One from quick question. Sir, I have 7 people now waiting.
All right. Okay. Okay.
And you can catch Harsh. You can catch Harsh whenever you want to catch.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take
You
it
don't
back.
need my pattern. But hopefully we'll come back to you at the end. Quick questions from Mr. Gautam Sen and from Akanksha. Gautam Sen, please unmute yourself. Quick question.
Am I audible now?
Loud and clear. पूछे साहब क्या बंद कर दिया? You are all right. Why did you switch off? Gautam Sen, you are audible.
It's okay now?
Yes, it's okay. Please ask. Don't touch. Just ask.
You see, I wanted to draw attention of the audience and the honorable speaker to the Anchorage summit, not summit, the Anchorage interaction, which the United States and China had. So that was very significant. You know, the rise of China and the implications on the international scene, world order, etc. The United States was trying to set the, not red lines, I would say they're essential cardinal points. Now, that is very significant. Now, vis-a-vis China, we don't seem to have acted likewise. And anyway, our grasp of the rise of China, the implications of that was very, very slow. And then, of course, the capacities were not there, as the speaker mentioned. So in this backdrop, I wanted some reaction from the speaker.
Before Harsh, you reply to that, Akanksha.
Sir?
I want a student to ask a question. Yes, Akanksha, please go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was with respect to India's policy towards China. So West has recently pursued full-on confrontation after trying partnership with China when they raised the issues of Xinjiang and Tibet. So since China is India's neighbor, to what degree should India balance its foreign policy by raising the confrontational questions besides the economic trade that can be pursued?
Thank you, Akanksha. Harsh, could you take those 2 and then we can go ahead? I have 6 more actually now.
On the Anchorage, I think it has always been very interesting how major powers relate to one another, and it has always been for smaller states, for middle ranking powers. This is always a foreign policy, big unknown unknowns or known unknowns rather. That that there is always a temptation among major powers to come to a modus vivendi with each other. And this is, if you go back to Obama administration, they talked about a G2 when they had come to power. That let us get together with the Chinese and frame a global response to the global disorder, and where China can manage the Pacific and we can manage the Atlantic. And that was emerging at that point in time. It did not work out. It basically collapsed because clearly, Chinese also indicated that they're not interested. They want to supersede the Americans. They don't want to have an engagement with the Americans where they are saying, trying to wait it out. So I think while China would want parity with the Americans in terms of as a negotiating partner. What the Chinese have also signaled is that they are not interested, and what the Americans have realized that the costs of not taking on China are rising by the day. So therefore, you see this competitive influence which is dominating now in this model of major power engagement, and therefore the other powers have to react the way they did, and therefore there's always this question of hedging which comes to mind often, that how far can you trust the Americans? Tomorrow they may decide to join hands with the Chinese for the larger, as much as they did during the Cold War with the Soviets. But that's an assessment that you have to make. As a country like India, which is now becoming a major pole in the international system, you have to keep on assessing that continuously, and therefore this, the topic that we are discussing today, and that from where we started, even Shakti mentioned it. It's a permanent feature of any country that claims to have that wants to have a place in the world. You have to continuously reassess global power shifts and your role in that. The other issue on India and China, I think at this point it seems that India's engagement or disengagement with China is premised on what is happening on the border. It is also premised on the fact that China is not is largely intransigent on the border question, and we are looking at the India-China equation through that prism, and therefore everything is on the table, it seems, whether it is trade relations. Of course, the numbers tell us a different story, because you can't really change the trajectory of a bilateral economic partnership in a matter of months. But the idea is there that you have to manage China by walling off certain sectors in India, by making it clear to China that there will be costs on certain issues while putting up certain kinds of partnerships, and also by engaging in the kind of diplomatic engagement that you are seeing, where India is insistent that unless border issues brought back to the table with a degree of firmness, the broader relationship will remain in a flux, that we won't be able to move forward, something which China wants. So clearly, I think that the divergence is very substantive on that fundamental question, and that is shaping our approach to China at the moment. But what is also shaping, I think, our response is this larger question of what is happening to the global order, how China is responding to issues like COVID-19, what has its role been in international institutions, and how China continues to scuttle a large part of India's global agenda, not simply bilateral agenda.
Thank you. Akanksha, I would recommend you two books which have just come out. One is Vijay Gokhale's book on how China negotiates and therefore what it should do, and the other is Kanti Vajpayee's book. I think you'll answer your question. It'll answer a lot of your doubts also about, can you really balance China, kind of a thing in there. I mean, okay, America is far away, China next door, should we accommodate them, etc. It'll help you a lot. Now, her two hands that I've got here, and then there are 4 written questions. The 2 hands are HP and Ashish Kotadia. So HP, could you ask a question quickly, and Ashish, and then you could just scroll the chat box. Manisha Sharma has an interesting question from Aniket. Kanashapuri has a very interesting question. Ganga Mekong. Sirajuddin has a question, and Pratisha Gogoi has a question. So HP and then Ashish, could you raise your questions?
So I'm Nandini Bhattacharya, Panda, HP.
Okay, so just tell me, how will I know? It says HP. Read out as it is.
So mine is, I'm a historian, not an international relations person. So it is a question from a layperson, very basic and from popular perception. Actually, China factor is now a major challenge. And all we know about China, that it is a very secretive political power. We don't get to know anything from China. And there were a lot of rumor about the date and everything. So when knowledge is power, that is a historian would observe, and so many historians have written. So if a state like India would like to deal with a secretive state like China, then yes, defense is definitely the most important factor, but would then the state put special emphasis to refurbish or to renovate or innovate the intelligence mechanism?
And Ashish?
Yeah, sir. I wanted to ask you in context of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, except India, while all the members of the SCO are the advocates and supporters of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's policy. While India did not endorse because of the CPEC, which compromised with our territorial integrity and sovereignty. But sir, India's after the formation of the Squad group leading by the United States of America and India's more growing engagement towards the Squad group, don't you think it will resulted into the Russia's alienation from the India's partnership and growing much engagement with the China? Because as former diplomat Shiv Shankar Menon sir in his book The Choices inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy, he mentioned two approach of the US, the population-centric approach and the military-centric approach, which US used especially in Afghanistan and the Vietnam, and which were completely failed. So don't you think that India should independently challenge the China's dominance in the Indo-Pacific region instead of becoming a part of US and compromise with our ethos of foreign policy like the global good and multipolar focus, especially
I think you made your point. I think I'm sure Harsh
Yes.
can.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
running out of time because I have such good questions by young people. I wanted to give them a chance.
Yeah,
Sorry.
definitely.
Sorry. Harsh, over to you. You're muted.
Yeah, Shaki, I have also noted some of the questions that are there in the chat box. I'll briefly
Please answer them.
Yeah.
Please answer them. That'd be fantastic.
I'll take them. I'll go first to the questions that were asked in person. So there was the question on secrecy and intelligence, and I think that's a great question. I think because that's the real challenge of the day. And in some ways, when you see this notion of democracies versus autocracies, it is more defined by what is happening in the world of in this gray zone world where you have these tactics being used by countries like China and Americans would say like Russia, that are using information as a weapon and misinformation as a weapon, in fact, and interfering with the practices that an open society, an open democracy allows them. So there is an inherent imbalance in the system, and that has been the modus operandi for the Chinese for a very long time. Like they would not give you access to their markets, but they got access to all the markets in the West. They would not allow you the privileges of even certain things like imagine an Indian newspaper wanting to carry with some information material about India in global times. It will never happen. But our newspapers regularly carry Chinese Communist Party propaganda. So there is an inherent asymmetry in the way the two societies are organized because of the way we are organized. We don't want to be like China, but clearly we have to find mechanisms of tackling that challenge. What happened in Australia woke Australians up because their Chinese were interfering in the political process in Australia, in the democratic process of Australia, because it allowed them to do so. It was open, it was transparent. A democracy, by very definition, is different from a communist party state. And therefore, what we cannot do in China, Chinese can do to India and in India. And I think that's a challenge where we have to be prepared for. And I am sure, people like Mr. Sood have written extensively on this dynamic of how nations should be prepared for the kind of wars, for the kind of challenges that are emerging between different kinds of societies. And I completely agree that Indian intelligence will have to look at things from a very, very different perspective, because China is not Pakistan. The kind of intelligence challenges that emanate from Pakistan, they are almost today of a second order effect of what is happening or what China has the potential to do if they want to do. We already know certain kinds of issues that are emerging in cyber security, for example. But it can go beyond that. It can go to a point where our democracy itself becomes a target, and that is something that we have to be aware of. We have to be cognizant of, and we have to have a response to that. So this question, and then the question on I think Ashish's question on Russia, which is very important one. And there, I think I just pointed it out very briefly in my initial remarks, because global power shift also means that your alliances, your relationships will undergo a change, right? China's, again, it's very interesting. China was a partner of Soviet Union. Then in the 70s, it shifted to America. Today, you are seeing China and Russia working together. So I don't think that if you are smart about your partnerships, you can use those partnerships to your advantage. And I personally have no idea. I don't think that working with America makes us any less reduces our autonomy. I think working with America, working with like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, ASEAN, it enhances our strategic autonomy. I think it's the other way around. When you work with other countries, you have a response to the China challenge. Otherwise, what are you challenging China in? We can all, in theory, say we can independently challenge China. But I think we all know that it's not possible. Independently, what can India do? Independently, what are your options? Independently, how will you manage the larger domain of Indo-Pacific? So I don't buy that argument that there is great degree of independence, that our independence is compromised when we work with others. Countries around the world, countries throughout history, India throughout history has worked with partners, and I think we will have to work with partners because of the challenge we are facing is unprecedented. So and Russia, therefore, we have to engage with Russia to a certain extent because of various issues on Afghanistan, on defense, etc. But Russia's foreign policy, we also have to understand that foreign policy is not a one-way street. Foreign policy is what others do to us as well. So what Russia is doing to India is also important to recognize. That India today is not the first order priority for Russia. Russia's foreign policy is also changing. Russia is looking at the world through the prism of the West. And in that struggle with the West, China is a very important partner for Russia. So if China is a very important partner for Russia, because Russian foreign policy is about challenging the West, then India becomes a second order priority. So clearly, I think the choices are there. We reach out to the Russians and try to manage a very, very important relationship. But it is not simply in our hands. It is not that we are controlling all the strings. Russians also are controlling the strings. So if they are willing to reciprocate, it's good. If they are not willing to reciprocate, then you'll have to find other alternatives. So I think it's not one way. The point that I wanted to make. And there were questions about Indo-Pacific as a zone of contestation. I think certainly Indo-Pacific is a zone of contestation, given that Indo-Pacific is the domain, is the maritime geography that has emerged primarily because of China's rise and India's push to becoming a part in that larger dynamic. Indo-Pacific would not have emerged if China were not this powerful, and Indo-Pacific would not have become an operational reality if India would not have signaled that it is willing to play a larger role in the larger Asian-Pacific framework. So I think that the rise of Indo-Pacific, by definition, is full of contestation. So while rhetoric, it's all fine, but I think we should all realize that Indo-Pacific is going to be a zone where high degree of contestation will take place, and we will have to work with multiple partners to make sure that our equities are preserved. Most of them are like-minded, most of them are willing to work with us, but the most important player in this dynamic is going to be China, because China is the one that is shaping the Indo-Pacific by definition. China, and in this regard, you had Quad, and this question was raised about Quad as a counter to BRI. I think, Quad is slightly different from BRI. BRI is an attempt by China to shape the geo-economic realities of the world through the frame of infrastructure financing. And that they have done, they have poured in a lot of money. In some places, they have had some successes. In some places, they have had problems. I think it's being renegotiated within China itself. So we will see a different form of BRI over a period of time. But Quad is technically not about BRI. Quad is an institutional arrangement that is about Indo-Pacific, about managing the trends in the Indo-Pacific, about the ability of like-minded countries to come to a geography where institutions actually do not exist. There is a paucity of institutions, and Quad is an informal arrangement where it is trying to manage, or at least an attempt is being made to manage this larger field of, the larger zone of contestation as we were discussing. And finally, I think the question on China and SAR, which was asked in the chat box, I think that's something which is very, very important for us to consider. That when you say SAR, I want to say China in South Asia and China in the Indian Ocean region. This is the region where India has technically or traditionally said that this is an area of great importance to India. And now we are witnessing this area's balance of power changing because China is entering in a major way. It is not only China's fault. China will go wherever its interests take China. It is also a question of smaller states in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region trying to use China and India to their advantage. And that will, I think, that is going to be a persistent feature of South Asia from now on. We really cannot go back to the days of 70s and 80s where India was the only game in town in South Asia. China is a very important economic actor. It is a very important actor on infrastructure financing. It is a very important actor in development aid. It is a very important actor in strategic and defense matters for all countries, and not only Pakistan. And therefore, India is struggling to figure out a response because India clearly has traditionally looked at the region with great degree of importance. And it is important if China becomes, China dominates the region, starts dominating the region, then it will have consequences for India. But I don't think that India will given that easily. So the push and pull, that contestation in South Asia will be the story of, I think, the next few decades as we go through this process of power transition, as we go through this process of China's rise, India's rise, and how the two countries try to negotiate a modus vivendi.
Of course, there are many other questions, but I think we'll running out of time. Manisha had a very tough question, in fact, on Fukuyama. It is not the American model as such. And how do the arrangements with other countries? Kansopori's question on Ganga Mekong. But I think you broadly covered a lot of ground. And I think our thoughts will never end. So I think we'll call it a day now. We have, but on the question of China, I've drawn attention of people to Dr. Harsh Pant's article in Hindustan Times of July 20th. The article is titled On China. What is it? The End of Delusion, something, right? Harsh, what was it? The End of Delusion and things like that, right? Something like that. I'm forgetting the title.
Persistence of stalemate.
I made a mistake there. Yes, it is. So, so I think it's worthwhile exploring. It is a challenging situation for India. We cannot be blessed about it. We cannot ride the storm. The feeling that if we do nothing, many problems get sorted out by themselves. Absolutely. The revisionist power trying to change the world order, and somebody who knows Chanakya again will know about a revisionist power. Revisionist powers try to change situation through various means. In this case, India is not the revisionist power, but India is at the other end of it, the receiving end of it. And therefore, you really can't sit back and wait for circumstances to change in your favor. One of the worst human failings, which applies to institutions and bigger institutions and individuals, is that strategies which work at one time may actually be a liability at the other time. And just because it worked in the past, there is no guarantee to work again. As Einstein was once asked, you change your mind. He said, well, or Keynes was asked, you change your mind. He says, when the circumstances change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? In other words, you cannot ignore the changing world, the changing situations. We have not lost Russia in the sense. Russia is very clear about what it wants. In that scheme of things, you cannot replace China. I mean, if you understand that, we'll have a better view of what we can do, and we can still do a lot with Russia. So it's not an either-or situation that we're looking at. There's a sufficient amount of grayness, some not a dotted lines. There are no hard walls, generally not. There are some cases, of course. So I think Dr. Pant has given us a lot of scope for ideas. The fact it provokes so many questions, and I'm sure if we start answering them, it will take another 1 hour at least to go into the details, the kind of details that is really required to answer them. So we'll stop there. Before I end and thank our speaker and all of you, next Friday at 4 o'clock, Dr. Ila Pant will be speaking on Atmanirbhar Bharat. The week after that, we'll be looking at multimodal transit in South Asia, specifically India and Bangladesh, to bring the element that between domestic policy and foreign policy, there are broad continuum, there are no hard barriers. I wonder if Mr. Vikram Sood is still here. Around that period, we'll be discussing his book also. So that we have a lot of things coming up your way. We hope you continue to join us. And as I said, please send us an email, those of you are still here, so that we are sure that you get your information in time. Harsh, it was a pleasure listening to you as always. I echo with many of what others have said, starting with Vikram Sood. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, thought-provoking. And I'm glad that many people had different points of view. That is the whole purpose of organizing these webinars. You write, you speak to try and to try changing the point of view of the other person. You're not explaining yourself. You're trying to actually provoke you into making shifts in your thinking. And I think you have done that, Harsh. Thank you to all of you for joining us. It was a pleasure. Last 1 hour and 15 minutes has passed at a very quick speed. So interesting it was. So thank you very, very much. And we shall see you. Sood Sahab, aap to hai hi hai. Very good. So we shall discuss bilaterally about your program. And now you know why I did not allow you to ask a follow-up question. It's all numbers. That's been a pleasure. And we shall hear you also very soon. Your book, I think, needs to be discussed, especially for our young students in Baroda to really understand what it is, all these nitty-gritties and these statecraft in all its dimensions.
I'll be very happy. I'm very happy to talk to them.
Lovely. Thank you very, very much. And we shall see all of you next Friday.
Thank you.
4 o'clock.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Shakti. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great presentation, Pant. Harsh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Seeing you after a long time.
Take
Pankaj
care.
bhi aa gaya na?
Thank you very much, Shakti. Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you,
Pant.
Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you.